Well, welcome, Rowan. This is the Wakefield Tower. It's part of a medieval palace in the Tower of London. And I wanted to meet you here because one of the key figures in queer royal history is Edward II, and he'd have used this space when he stayed at the Tower.
So when you say one of the kind of key figures of queer royal history, what do you mean by that? What was kind of the history of him and his life?
A key part of his biography is his relationship with two male favourites, the main one being a man called Piers Gaveston. And because you're looking a long way back in time, there's been a lot of debate over the years about what that relationship was. But a big idea is that it was a love relationship. It was and also possibly a physical relationship between these two men.
Do you think it's, I guess, the importance in general for like Britain, for example, for us to know our history, but specifically for queer people, is there a significance there for like modern queer people to know about historical figures?
I think it's really important for people to know where they've come from, to know what their heritage is. It's a way of anchoring yourself. It's a way of working out why you're here today and why society is as it is today. And I don't think you can understand the place of queer people in society today without understanding that very long history that got us to where we are now.
So what would that look like in terms of if you were looking for like an artifact or a source of some kind? What kind of sources would you be looking for? If you were looking back, would it be writings? Would it be art? Like how would you start to dig in and try and figure out what was kind of a part of this queer history?
Well, because queer lives are really integral to human society, the evidence can be found in lots of different places. And as you've just said, that can be found in written records, it can be found in art as well, and it can even be found in the architecture of the palaces, for instance, that we look after. Very often, queer history can be found in legal records, and this perhaps is why the evidence is often skewed to men. So it's often easier to find queer histories that involve men because sex between men was a criminal offence, so it finds its way into the legal records, certainly in this country. We don't have legal records for sex between women in this country in the same way, though if you look in Europe at the same time, say 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, you'll find legal records there because the authorities did prosecute women who had sex with other women. So legal records is part of it, but legal records only really tell us when things went wrong. When a charge was brought against another person or where two people were discovered. And so what we can lose sight of if we just rely on legal records is the huge range of queer experience. One thing I say over and over again when I'm thinking about queer history, talking about queer history, is we can't just look for sex. And there is this feeling with historians that you can't say someone is queer in the past unless you find evidence of them having sex with somebody of the same gender. And my argument with that is, like, how often when you have sex do you go and write it down on a piece of parchment and then put it in the archive to last for all time? It's just not how people work. So we need to look for other evidence as well when we're looking for queer lives, because we know that there's so much more to queer lives than sex. It's about who you are, it's about your place in society. And relationships, any relationship, is based on a lot more than sex. It's about friendship, it's about shared feeling, a shared sense of humour even. It's about love. So we need to look for records of that in the past.
So I have kind of said it before, but I really do think there's something interesting about the way in which you look at queer men's history as being recorded in like court documents and medical records, and then you have queer women's history that's almost like letters and diaries by candlelight, and both of them end up with this something missing, I think, from the picture, because you have queer men's stories that you're absolutely right, like it feels indisputable in terms of like this person was literally by a court of law found to be homosexual, but you don't necessarily get that person's emotional life, their personality, their thoughts, their feelings about even what was happening to them when those court records were being created. But then on the other hand, you have women, for example, that were writing letters to each other that are full of like affection and love, but you always have these people being like, well, it wasn't proven, was it? Like that really good friends, weren't they? That was just how people talked to each other back then. And so there's always this kind of invalidation in a lot of ways. And I guess the way I like to think about it in terms of if people are like, you know, well, you can't tell 100% that a figure in history was queer. I'm like, well, if that's true, then we can't tell 100% anyone in history was straight, to be honest. Like if you have this much evidence and you're still going to deny it, then you can also not say anything for certain about anyone at that point. So they say that history is written by the victors, and I think that can be obviously in battle or in wars, the country or the force that wins kind of imposes what they want onto the place that they've conquered. But I also think that there is a kind of social victory that informs history. So who are the people that have the privilege to be literate in the time that they're living, that they can record things down in writing? More recently, that might have cameras or video equipment that they can record themselves in that way. They can pay to have art done of them, or even just they have the luxury of enough time to be recording their lives. And I think that goes for anyone in history of any identity, but there is something specific about queerness where you also potentially have this gap with people who have enough kind of social privilege to be able to feel like they have some kind of safety in admitting or writing down or recording in any way this thing that is taboo or illegal or is persecuted in some way. Do you think that the artifacts of history and the evidence of history, queer history that we have, are informed by these elements of privilege?
And absolutely, privilege and class and wealth is a huge factor in this as well. Obviously, I mainly look at palaces, which were lived in by kings and queens, where you have a huge amount of written evidence that survives from them, and that also other people wrote down. So people observe monarchs and write about them, and that's a great source of evidence. But we also do get little glimpses sometimes of these less privileged people. Another example of where you can take a legal record and apply it to someone who we knew would have been at the Tower is the case of Kathleen Woodhouse, which I only discovered the other day. Kathleen was brought before a magistrate's court in 1918, accused of being a deserter. They were also known by the name of Frederick Wright, and so the court accused them of adopting women's clothes to desert the army. And yet when you look at the reporting of the court case, you realise that Kathleen wants to be known as Kathleen and wishes she'd been born a woman, and loves wearing dresses because that reflects the life she wants to lead. And then when you realise that Kathleen was part of the Royal Fusiliers, which is the regiment that since the 17th century has been based at the Tower, you can see how you can take a little legal record and you can apply it to, and realise it is part of the history of somewhere like the Tower of London.
I mean, it kind of goes without saying, I guess, but there's, in terms of these like intersecting identities that go across each other, you've kind of, not only do we have in general within a kind of class system, some people who were not traditionally educated, didn't have access to education, and then women on top of that, less likely. I think you also have examples of like race, for example, that people who weren't white in the country, if we look at the ways in which they've been structurally oppressed, that then maps onto when you have queer people of colour, how little their stories are necessarily told or preserved in a lot of ways. So I think it's really interesting that when trying to dig through, you have these people who on multiple levels have had their histories erased or seen as unimportant enough to document. So it's really difficult, I think, to go back into history and try and find these people who have been kind of hidden in the cracks almost.
And I had a colleague say to me the other day, hidden histories. I was like, no, forcibly obscured histories, actually. One of our key figures for queer history. at Hampton Court Palace and especially at Kensington Palace, because those are centres of the Georgian court, is Lord Hervey. And he had a 10-year relationship with a man called Steve Fox. And it's also thought that he may have had a close relationship with Frederick, Prince of Wales. So he's the son of George II and the father of George III. But we don't know, because although Hervey leaves us fantastic and quite gossipy and bitchy written records of life at the Georgian court and lots of letters, just as this relationship between Frederick, Prince of Wales and Lord Hervey looks like it's getting interesting, a censorious 19th century Hervey, so one of Lord Hervey's descendants, cut the pages out. So quite literally there is a gap there in history. Now that might have been a bit of an own goal for that 19th century Hervey, because nowadays people read whatever they want to into that gap. But that is a great example actually of history being erased. And one of my favourite queer historians, Claire Barlow, has said that queer history is basically full of bonfires. That so often we know that there was a piece of evidence and we know when it was destroyed by usually family members who see that having a queer person in their family past is shameful. And so to preserve their family name and honour, literally destroy that record and that history. And that, as a historian, that breaks my heart.
I wanted to ask you, I guess on the flip side, we talked about the idea of, you know, if we have these records, whose records aren't we having? Why do you think people, because when I talked to people about the fact I was going to do this video, there were multiple people who asked like, oh, can you ask them about like gay monarchs? Like, is that a thing? Was that a thing?
It was a thing.
It was
Definitely.
conclusive.
Definitely, yeah.
It definitely was a thing. But I think it's interesting that why do we have such an interest in the idea of like proving that we had, like, why is it somehow more important for a gay monarch than just like anyone being gay in the 17th century? And I think in part that is just because of this idea of class, which is very embedded in society, the idea of like, look, this important person was queer, therefore queer and important kind of feel like they've historically can be linked together. Would you like to see more queer history being taught in schools, for example?
Well, it's a long time since I've been in school and a long time since I studied history in school, so I'm not quite sure what is taught nowadays. But as we've been saying, queer lives are so integral to history and to human experience that they should be. If you're learning about history, you should learn about queer lives. And so many periods of history or people in history don't make sense unless you talk about their queer relationships or their queer identities. And it's also important to remember in here that there are age-appropriate ways of doing that as well. That sexuality and queer identity aren't just about sex. They're about love and relationships. I mean, people are taught in school about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and if that is not an example of extreme heterosexuality and unbelievable misogyny, I don't know what is. And if you can talk about Henry VIII and his relationships, why not talk about romantic relationships between people of the same sex? But I spend a lot of my time thinking about the past and trying to work out what life was like in the past. But what do you think about these issues today and where we're going?
I do see a lot of, I think always when there's progress there's backlash, and I think we see that all the time, where a step will be taken forwards, and because that particular group, marginalised group, whether it's queer people or any other, has previously been relegated to the shadows, as soon as they come forward and ask for equality, there will be a lot of people who see that ask as and ask for superiority in some way, or and ask for more than they deserve, whether or not they would necessarily phrase it like that or think about it like that. That if you make a fuss, then it's kind of almost hanging over your head, like if you behave well, if you don't make a fuss, then we'll let you be. And so I think it's really important to not lose that kind of rebellious spirit, not just in terms of kind of identity and how you express yourself, but also in terms of saying, well, who else can we have solidarity with? What other queer like communities around the world can we support? What ways can we rebel against the status quo that for so many years said that we weren't worthy to get married and to have our relationships were, as Section 28 said, pretended family relationships, for example, which was so recently, that we can say, okay, well, who else is having that kind of rhetoric around it? And I think so at the moment, I think that the way in which trans people are being talked about in the mainstream is very indicative of how gay people were talked about in the mainstream. And so I think that there is something still quite kind of radical and within those roots to look at other people and say, like, how can we use what we've had to go through and the tactics we've used in order to get equality to kind of help other people. So I think there is a value in allowing people to be themselves and to have that kind of individuality and liberation. But I also think that like coming together as a group, we can do some really exciting, like radical stuff together, I guess.
And I think while perhaps modern life might feel confusing, that's something where historians can come in actually. And I think you do see people start talking about history and then they start relating it to today and their own lives. So by providing the long view, which is what historians and curators do, you can help people to make connections.
Amazing. Thank you so much for talking to me. This has been very interesting.
Thank you so
Covered
much
all
for
the
coming
topics.
in. Thank you.